From DLA Piper, this is the Beyond the Curve podcast. In this episode, DLA Piper's Richard Hands, a veteran of the U.S. Navy and chair of the firm's Veterans and Military Family Resource Group, is joined by Jon Macaskill, a retired Navy SEAL commander turned mindfulness and meditation teacher, to discuss veteran mental health.
Welcome to our Beyond the Curve podcast. I'm Rich Hands, co-managing partner of DLA Piper's New York office and chair of its Veterans and Military Families Resource Group. Our group is a collection of our lawyers and business professionals who've served in the military, have family members serving, or who otherwise wish to support our efforts. And we're particularly proud of our firm's dedication to veteran legal issues through our signature pro bono project, Serving Those Who Served. I'm looking forward to our discussion today with Jon Macaskill. Jon is a 2001 graduate of the United States Naval Academy and a retired and decorated Navy SEAL commander. I followed Jon and I connected with him on LinkedIn, and I've enjoyed and highly recommend his podcast, Men Talking Mindfulness. Welcome, Jon. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Rich. It's an honor to be here.
That was great. Well, we're only a couple days removed from Memorial Day, so I thought I would start with getting your thoughts on the holiday and what it means to you, and then we can start talking about veteran issues.
Sure. Memorial Day means a lot of things to me, but the meaning of the holiday itself often is confused with Veterans Day. Memorial Day is a day to remember those who have paid the ultimate sacrifice while in service. Some people get that further confused with losing their lives or paying the ultimate sacrifice on the battlefield or in combat, but you could have lost your life in some other way while you're in service. And it's the time to honor those who have paid that ultimate sacrifice. And then Memorial Day specifically means a lot to me because I do have a lot of friends who I lost in the service, both from the Naval Academy classmates or fellow SEALs who did pay the ultimate sacrifice on the battlefield.
Yeah, thanks, Jon. That's something I always try to remind folks around our firm and our office. It is unique in that regard, and it's a holiday that I urge people to keep sacred.
Absolutely.
Even if we're going to have barbecues and the like on that day. So let's shift a little to some of the other things. I mentioned your Men Talking Mindfulness podcast. Love it. I think it's unique in many respects. And how did you come to start this and why? And what's your target audience?
Well, the target audience has been a moving target since the beginning. Honestly, where it started, how it started, goes to my having a mindfulness practice and being a meditation teacher now on the other side of wearing the uniform. Now that I've transitioned out of the military, that's what I do. And I got introduced to my co-host, Will Schneider, who is a yoga teacher in New York City. And we were having a phone call once a month or so, just regular phone calls about our own practices, the mindfulness and meditation practices and the challenges that we were having or the revelations that we had or whatever the case may be. We were having these phone calls. And we realized that what we were talking about, other people may want to listen to. So we started on Instagram Live initially, right at the kickoff of the pandemic, as things were starting to go virtual more. We thought maybe we could share via Instagram Live. And we started there, and it started very small, had a very small following of 10 people. And then it started to grow slowly, and we had a few folks say, hey, maybe this would be a great podcast. Our target audience was men initially, so that we could open up the practice of meditation and mindfulness, the way of living mindfulness, to men who are normally a little more hesitant to try these. So that was our initial target audience. But since then, it's grown, and it is called Men Talking Mindfulness because it is two men initially, myself and my co-host, talking about it. But we bring guests on from all walks of life, all backgrounds. We have discussions about things varying from motherhood to movement and why movement is good and why hydration is good. And it's all tied to living mindfully. So it's still called Men Talking Mindfulness, but we have opened up our audience to really anyone who needs to learn to live a better life. And we pride ourselves on having raw, uncut, and authentic conversations. So that's really what the genesis of the show is and our target audience.
It's great. I have found it in many ways provocative, although that sounds like a strong word to use here, but it's made me think about other things. And I have to think that even if it's not your particular target, certainly so many veterans could benefit from the mindfulness process and meditation and the like that you talk about regularly.
100%. I pride myself on sharing these practices with veterans because I do believe they are helpful for those who are still in uniform. In their service, it is helpful. It is helpful through the transition process from transitioning from the military into being a veteran. And then it is helpful in the life that we live afterwards. So we've done episodes on that very thing, on the transition process and how mindfulness helped me through that. And then on both sides of the uniform as well. So absolutely, that's part of our target audience, though it's not specifically defined as that. It is definitely part of it.
When we spoke before, we talked about the transition issues. And the one thing that really jumped out at me was a phrase that you used, loss of tribe, and how that affects an individual transitioning from the service out into civilian life. Can you talk a little about that and why that is such an important issue to address when you transition out of the service?
Sure. I mean, it really goes back to the old saying, birds of a feather flock together. And when you move in the military, I think I moved 20 something times in the 24 years that I was in, you instantly have a tribe that you're plugged into when you move to a new area. And a lot of the time when you leave the military, you're leaving that tribe behind. We've all had the same purpose in serving our country, in serving that particular unit. We work out together, we eat together, we work together. And it seems as though when you leave the military, you leave that brotherhood, sisterhood, tribe, whatever you want to call it, and they keep going. They keep doing what it is they were doing. Their mission stays the same. And you just step off this moving train. It seems like you step off this moving train and this train leaves you behind. And there's a feeling almost of abandonment. And that's a two-sided coin. One, that you've been abandoned by them. They've continued going and doing what they do with their mission, their focus, their purpose. Now you no longer have that mission, your focus, your purpose. And then you've abandoned them in a way. It feels that way, in that they are continuing to fight for this country, whether that's literally fighting or serving behind a computer, helping others to fight the good fight. And you are no longer doing that. And it feels as though you've abandoned them. So it's a really tough emotional cocktail that you experience as you're working towards that transition. And then as you finally hang that uniform up for the last time and you retire or you get out after 4 years or whatever, it feels like you're leaving a tribe behind and that they're leaving you behind.
So very true. I remember that feeling when I left. And I was a submarine officer back in the day. But when I first walked off my boat and transitioned out, that boat went on and did other things. And you feel a strangeness about that relationship now going forward. So I can understand it. And I'd have to think it's all the more so for those who have been engaged in the wars of recent years as well, especially the tightness of those groups or how tight those groups can be going forward. You suddenly are ripped away from that, or you take yourself out of that, and it leaves you kind of sitting out there all by yourself.
Absolutely. And I think those emotions were even heightened due to the pandemic. I got out in August of 2020, so 6 months or so after the pandemic was really starting to ramp up here in the States, and we were shut down. A lot of us were working from home, even in the military. I served for 24 years and there was no retirement ceremony. There was a text from my former boss saying, "Thank you for your service." And that's not how I envisioned leaving the military. So it's almost like a romantic relationship ending and there not being any closure. It just suddenly ends. And that's what I think a lot of people experienced during the height of the pandemic in their transition.
Sure. I think the pandemic created a whole host of issues that none of us had ever really dealt with or experienced before, whether it was in transition or just in doing our jobs, and adding to a certain level of stress, mental anxiety, and the like that we hadn't really ever had to experience before, and maybe all the more so in that transition away from the military, where everything was taken care of for you, and now you're out here remote from everybody else, no matter what the job is that you may be transitioning into.
Exactly. It was unprecedented times and unprecedented emotions, mental struggles, physical struggles, emotional, spiritual. Yeah, it was everything. So again, that cocktail was just magnified.
So I know mental health issues in particular with veterans are of keen interest to you and to me as well. And I wanted to talk a little about those issues that veterans are facing. I think there is a fair amount we've already talked about here about the transitional issues causing stress, but there's so much more that goes into the mental health issues that our veterans are facing. What are these additional issues that veterans are facing that are unique to the veteran community?
Yeah, there's a list. If I go through that list, it's going to sound as though veterans are a broken group, which we are not. We're just human beings, and we've been exposed to unique circumstances and responded to those circumstances like human beings most likely should. Now, what those are, they consist of things that we saw and did on the battlefield, all the way to moving around the states or the world and leaving your family behind, to family stressors, to financial stressors. There are a lot of the same stressors that the rest of the world has, but just magnified. So that makes things difficult. And I think the tribe piece, once you actually become a veteran and you hang up that uniform and now having to set up your own dental appointments. We've had a lot of those things taken care of for us while we're in the service. Set up your own dental appointments, medical appointments, your finances. You're having to go out and work a job and you don't know necessarily that you're going to get that next paycheck, where it's pretty much guaranteed within the military, even when there are furloughs and pay hold periods, but it's pretty much guaranteed. So there's a lot of great benefits of being in the military that when you, again, hang up that uniform, you're suddenly left holding your hat saying, okay, now what? And that's another additional layer on top of everything that you did in the military. And I want to go back to the first one that I mentioned there, what we did or saw on the battlefield. That is definitely distressing, whether you're in combat or whether you're back stateside and you saw something while you were flying a drone. You may have seen our own troops being shot at, or even worse, killed on the battlefield while you're flying a drone back here stateside. Or you may have seen the enemy killed on the drone feed. That can be distressing. But the other side of that coin is what we didn't do on the battlefield. There's some folks who train their entire military career and never see combat. And that in itself can be stress, anxiety, depression inducing. There's a feeling of, I am not a warrior, even though I wore a warrior's uniform, or I didn't do enough because my brothers and sisters died on the battlefield and here I am. So it's almost like a survivor's guilt of sorts. So there's a lot of unique stressors out there, but then there are a lot that are similar to what everyone else feels. They're just magnified.
I heard someone speak recently, and I thought it was interesting. He said we have to remove the word disorder from the post-traumatic stress, the PTSD.
Right.
Because to your point, Jon, we're all human beings. And so the stresses that you faced or anyone faced on the battlefield or off the battlefield and the like that they bring home with them, those stresses are not unusual. Whatever that trauma was, you're reacting as almost any human being would to that kind of stress or trauma or anxiety.
Right. Absolutely. I haven't ever been a fan of the PTSD. The D implies that you are reacting in an inappropriate manner to what it is you've been exposed to, the trauma that you've been exposed to. It's a disorder. In my opinion, if you are exposed to extreme trauma and you do not have some type of emotional and or mental reaction to it, that's where things get concerning to me. So I've always thought post-traumatic stress and just leave it at that. That's a natural response. And now you're starting to hear post-traumatic growth. in some media. And I think that as much as I would never wish trauma on anyone, the growth that can come after it is profound. I personally was exposed to my own levels of trauma, and I feel that I am a better person for it, a better husband, a better father, and hopefully a better man in society, contributing to my society, my community because of it. So again, I don't ever want to wish trauma on anyone, but it can be an opportunity to grow.
I think as long as society continues to label it as that post-traumatic stress disorder, it impedes the individual's ability to grow from whatever it was that they endured. But that's a tough thing because it sells in the press in many respects. I know many veterans that have grown out of their personal trauma, their personal issues that they dealt with. And I have also seen the veterans who've struggled with it and the like. So I think the growth aspect of this is something that we should probably focus more on going forward and encouraging veterans to think about it from that perspective, growing and becoming that better person as you move forward. I love that idea.
Right. Absolutely. Also, as much as I don't want to wish trauma on anyone, I also don't want to imply that because you have gone through trauma, you must grow, because then there becomes a sense of guilt. If someone is truly struggling with what it is they experienced and they're not growing, then they feel as though they're not good enough. And now they start having dark thoughts, and that can vary from one end of the spectrum to the other. But I don't want to imply that because you've gone through traumatic stress, you have to grow. But it is potentially an opportunity to grow, potentially.
That's a fair point, Jon. Fair point. So what are the options here? What can we do when it comes to dealing with veteran mental health issues? How do we advance the ball, so to speak, in helping veterans deal with mental health challenges? What are the roadblocks that you see to that?
Yeah, sure. So I have a sister who is actually a licensed clinical social worker at the VA, and I am a beneficiary of going to the VA and using their resources. And I can tell you that they, for the most part, are doing the best that they can. They are understaffed. They are under-resourced. The money is not as much as we all as veterans think it is. They're doing as much as they can with what they have, for the most part. There are fantastic resources there, varying from counseling to actual psychotherapy to mindfulness and meditation. I know in a lot of VA areas, you can actually get introduced to someone who will teach mindfulness and meditation, will teach yoga even. And those, as woo-woo as those sound to some, they are profound. The effects can be profound in addressing what we've discussed here so far, the mental health challenges as a service member, the mental health challenges as a transitioning service member, and the mental health challenges as a veteran, which is when you can obviously go to the VA. Now, that said, what else is there? There are literally thousands of veteran service organizations, nonprofits that are out there wanting to help. And it can be confusing. It can be overwhelming as a service member or as a veteran, looking at what can be known as, or has been called, the sea of goodwill. You don't know where to go. It's like you're sitting in front of your TV and you have 1,000 channels, and you're flipping with your remote, and you spend an hour flipping through before you ever watch anything. You realize, well, now I've burned an hour of time flipping through and never have actually watched anything. Well, you log on to the internet and you look up veteran mental health, and you get a slew of veteran organizations out there. So I recommend, as a veteran, starting with your VA and finding out through the VA what veteran service organizations are legitimate and are in your area and have the staffing and the funding to give you what you need. And I think that's one way to go about it. There are websites run by both the military, DoD, and by the VA administration that will help you as well. So check out their websites. Military OneSource for the DoD side, and then the VA side is a great one as well. So do your homework and you can find help. And then if you are in crisis, and you absolutely need someone right now, there is a national suicide hotline. And the number for that is 1-800-273-8255. That's 1-800-273-8255. And that I have in my phone, not necessarily for myself to use it, but as a veteran, if I run across another veteran and they need help, I can send them that number. And it's not just for veterans, it's for anyone. Once you dial that number and you hit 1, it will take you specifically to the veteran area. But that's if you're in crisis. So I wanted to make sure I put that out there as well.
Sure. That's great. What about how the military prepares you for that transition? You mentioned a couple of the sites that you can link into while you're transitioning, but does the military do enough to prepare the individual for what is available to them after they leave the service?
I think they're doing much better than they have in the past. The military branches themselves, they have, the Navy calls it TAPS, Transition Assistant Program. And the other services have something similar. I think the Army has Soldier for Life, SFL, and each service has something similar. But what those primarily are a few weeks telling you how to get your resume set, what to wear to an interview, how to answer interview questions, and how to prepare for an interview. So it's really preparing you for your next job. And more often than not, what they do is ask, okay, so what have you been doing for the last X number of years? Oh, you've been this particular military specialty. Well, you can do that or something similar in the outside world. Why don't we look for that job? Well, that's not necessarily what you want to do. Maybe you've worked for 4 years in a job. Maybe you've worked for 30 years in a particular job, and it's not what you want to do on the outside. A better way to do it is what some other organizations do is help you to identify your why or what drives you, help you to write your narrative, not your resume, but your narrative. Like, who are you? Who are you outside a uniform? Not who is Commander Macaskill, but who is Jon Macaskill? And then you take that and you take what you've been doing in those different capacities within your military service, and how does that translate in a different way to what you can do on the outside? Leadership, management, the ability to flex, the ability to work in volatile environments, uncertain environments, those types of things, the ability to relate to people, that kind of thing, rather than saying, this is your MOS, this is what equals that on the outside. And some great organizations that are out there for doing that. The Commit Foundation is a fantastic one. The Honor Foundation is primarily for those that work within the special operations community. The American Corporate Partners, they're a free mentor program that will partner you up with a member from corporate America, specifically in the area that you want to go into, and you team up for a year, and that mentor will help you through that. Another one is Veterati. This is, again, just a very microscopic view of what's out there as far as the veteran service organizations. But those are 4 that I can think of off the top of my head. Is Veterati is a mentorship program online or via phone. American Corporate Partners, the Honor Foundation, and the Commit Foundation are phenomenal.
I think one of the things to highlight is that the military can't be the one to help you transition because it's not what they do in many respects. Right. They can introduce you to the path, but it's not for the military services to tell you what your next job is going to be or the like. So it creates that little bit of a gap. From our perspective, as lawyers performing pro bono for a lot of veterans, one of the things we've found is that gap creates challenges for the veteran. The discharge grade of the individual affects what they can access later. That's another big issue facing veterans from a legal perspective, which can generate additional stresses and anxiety and the like for the veterans. That's something that we try to work with veterans all the time. Someone who had a general discharge, that means they can only have access to X services at the VA going forward, and or they have a bad conduct discharge, something that was a result of, let's say, some traumatic stress that they endured while in the service led to a bad conduct discharge. They're limited in what they can get coming out. And it's really hard to get the military, the Department of Defense, to reconsider those discharge grades going forward. And it's another little area of stress and strain that I think affects the veteran community, especially those coming out of some of the more direct war fighting over the last several years.
I can imagine. I personally don't have that issue. I was honorably discharged, but I can imagine what that stress is on an individual, and throw on the fact that maybe they are the primary breadwinner for the family. They may have a spouse, they may have 2 or 3 children, and they have a roof over their heads while they are in the military. Now they get, other than honorable or the general or the bad conduct discharge, and now they are not only having to deal with that, the stigma that comes with that, but the inability to get a job, get and hold a job because of what caused that. And that goes back to the stress or the trauma that they were exposed to that may have led them to the other than honorable or bad conduct discharge. It's disheartening, it's saddening, but it's tough also. The flip side of that is the military have a mission. And our mission is not to prepare people for their next job, just like you said. It is to serve and protect this country and our resources and our intentions, our values. So it's tough.
Fair enough. What else is important for us to know or understand about what is available out there for the veterans, what we should be doing, perhaps, to help the veteran community going forward?
Yeah, I think coming back full circle to one of your initial questions is that loss of tribe. There are other tribes out there, right? The military is and was a tribe and will continue to be. It doesn't mean that's all that's out there for us. We can go out and find tribes within our community. We can go out and find sports teams. We can go out and find other veteran groups within our community. We could go out and find churches that we can serve, some type of community service. There are other tribes out there. They are few and far between that match what the military is. So don't expect to find the exact same tribe, but you're not the exact same person. So it's okay to be part of a different tribe. So look for those opportunities to continue to serve. I think most of us join the military to serve because we have hearts of service. There are other ways to serve. And when you look for those other ways to serve, you're going to find those other tribes. So I think that's how I'd like to close.
That's a great way to close, Jon. And I strongly endorse that idea of continuing to serve however we may. But there are opportunities out there for us to take what we learned in the service and who we are and bring that to our community or communities in which we find ourselves. But Jon, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. And again, I highly recommend Jon's podcast, Men Talking Mindfulness. It's wonderful. You can follow him on LinkedIn as well. He is always offering some real thoughtful observations, and he's a great one to follow out there. So thank you again, Jon, for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you for having me. It's been an honor. Thank you for what it is you're doing here with your podcast and with your veteran group there. And again, thank you for putting this out there. It's important for veterans to hear this.
Absolutely. Take care, Jon.
You as well.
All information, content, and materials contained in this podcast are for general informational purposes only. This podcast is intended to be a general overview of the subjects discussed and does not create a lawyer-client relationship. Statements and opinions are those of the individual speakers and participants and do not necessarily reflect the policies or opinions of DLA Piper LLP US. The information contained in this podcast is not and should not be used as a substitute for legal advice. No listener should act or refrain from acting with respect to any particular legal matter on the basis of this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel in the relevant jurisdiction. This podcast may qualify as lawyer advertising, requiring notice in some jurisdictions. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. DLA Piper LLP US accepts no responsibility for any actions taken or not taken as a result of this podcast.